This episode of New Politics was released on the 16th of August, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Hello to our audience and hello to you, David. There's just so many things going on in this world that I just cannot keep up with all the pace.
It's been a massive week in plot twists, in unexpected behaviour. Spoiler alert, we're going to have a great time discussing it.
Well, we certainly are, and we've got another big episode coming up this week, David. So Australia is going to recognise the state of Palestine. What happens next? We look at journalists being targeted in conflict zones. We also look at journalists making up lies, and there's no surprise there. We also look at the interest rate cut during the week and the secret report that the government refuses to release. When are we going to find out what's really happening with climate change? That's a big issue, and that's all coming up in this very big episode of New Politics.
And I can't wait.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced that Australia will recognise the state of Palestine at the next United Nations meeting at the General Assembly in September. And while this is only the start of the process, there are a number of conditions that are attached, and that's for the Palestinian Authority to agree to recognise Israel's right to exist, that it goes through a process of demilitarisation and holds general elections as soon as possible. And just wanted to point out, David, that there are no conditions being placed on Israel at the moment. Here's what the Prime Minister said during the week.
Today I can confirm that at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September, Australia will recognise the state of Palestine. Australia will recognise the right of the Palestinian people to a state of their own, predicated on the commitments Australia has received from the Palestinian Authority. We will work with the international community to make this right a reality. Australia is making this statement today following our Cabinet meeting as part of a coordinated global effort building momentum for a two-state solution. Over the past fortnight, I have discussed this with Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, Prime Minister Luxon and Prime Minister Ishaba, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu last Thursday and President Abbas last Tuesday. A two-state solution is humanity's best hope to break the cycle of violence in the Middle East and to bring an end to the conflict, suffering and starvation in Gaza.
The Prime Minister did say that Australia would work with the international community to make recognition a reality, and that's great, of course, but there are just so many issues that need to be resolved for this to become a reality and for a real and long-term peace to come to fruition. Now, the first issue is that Israel has never wanted a two-state solution. There's also a lot of questions about what are the internationally recognised borders of Palestine. There's been a lot of land theft by Israel in the West Bank by settlers over the years, and we can't ignore all the war crimes and the crimes against humanity perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians since 1946, and especially over the past 2 years. And then there's also the other big issue of the United States, because nothing really happens in international affairs unless the United States agrees to it. So this is a first step. It's an important step, and it's also well overdue. It is frustrating because the wheels of international diplomacy turn over ever so slowly, but I think that this will clear the pathway for the next round of steps that just need to be taken.
It's a step in the right direction, no doubt, and recognition of the statehood of Palestine is not only Labor policy and a part of the Labor platform, but it's the right thing to do. Now, I'll probably get into a little bit of trouble here. The condition that they hold free and democratic elections, I think, is a good one. They haven't had elections there since 2006. And I think that it is time that the governing party, Hamas, was forced to give an election, and they will likely lose that. That's as it should be. Having said that, the rest of the conditions seem to me to be not conducive to long-term viability. Demilitarization, when you have an expanding neighbour and an obvious expanding neighbour, unless the United Nations says, look, you don't worry about the defence, pour your money into infrastructure, which they do need a lot of money for. A good percentage of the country has been flattened. Pour your money into healthcare, which of course they need with all the injuries, etc. Pour your money into education, pour your money into basically building the economy, and we will send in a task force who will basically be the military for the next few years. But that doesn't seem to be the condition. And this is where you start to see the compromise made with essentially Israel to keep them appeased. Now, they may have won the ground war, but they suddenly lost the moral side of it. 300 and some thousand people on the Harbour Bridge in Sydney showed that in Australia, at least, there's a big support for Palestinian statehood. I think it's also fair to say that most of the Middle East recognises Palestine as a state, and a lot of Europe either recognises or is about to recognise Palestine as a state. Actually, a lot of Africa and some of South America too. So it becomes quite a compelling argument that Palestine be recognised as a fully fledged state. The conditions seem superfluous, I think. And of course, as you rightly said, the borders are going to be an issue. I think the 48 borders are probably the best, but 67 would be fine too. Certainly the current illegitimate borders shouldn't be considered, and those that have gone in and taken over land should be sent back to where they were and the land restored to its rightful owners.
And this is going back 78 years, David, but back in 1947, the United Nations promised statehood to Palestine, and that was one of the first major acts of the United Nations, but it promised two states, a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. And we can argue about whether Palestine giving up so much land at the time to create the state of Israel was just or not, and I don't think it was just at all. But the point is that there was an official resolution from the United Nations, and it's United Nations Resolution 181. Israel was created and recognised, but Palestine wasn't. And Australia was actually a major part of that process at the time in 1947. That's when Doc Evatt was the president of the United Nations and the head of the General Assembly. Australia played a role in creating the state of Israel, but it also had a role in the creation of the state of Palestine, but that was left unfulfilled. So when Australia makes this recognition in September, if that actually proceeds according to plan, for me, this is unfinished business, and it's not the end of the process, it's just the start of the process. But there's just a lot that needs to be done, and a lot of this is cleaning up the historical mess left behind by Britain. But Gaza will need to be rebuilt, Israeli settlers will have to leave the West Bank, and Israel will need to be held accountable. Its leadership needs to be sanctioned, the country needs to be sanctioned, and it's got to pay reparations. And this will need to continue until the state of Israel starts behaving itself. And Israel is not really going to change its behaviour until economic sanctions are applied. And there is an ongoing call for sanctions to be placed upon Israel. Here's Nasha Masni, the president of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, speaking during the week.
We have a range of sanctions on the Russian state. We are asking to be treated, I mean, it's too much for a brown person, but indulge me, for a brown person to expect they might be treated half white. But we know if 100,000 Ukrainians had been slaughtered, if Ukrainian babies were being starved as Palestinian babies were being starved, that Australia would do more than choose to maybe recognise Ukraine. They would do more. Our brown babies, our brown men, our brown women are as innocent and as deserving of humanity as any other human being. We have hopes and dreams and dignity, and it must be afforded to us. The fact that Anthony Albanese thinks that recognition is enough is shameful.
And I think this is a very good question. Why sanction Russia but not Israel? And we saw it in South Africa. South Africa just ignored everyone for 15 years, but when hard sanctions were put in place in 1985, and they had a range of soft sanctions before that, but when the hard sanctions were put in place in 1985, well, that's when South Africa finally started to take notice. And 5 years later, it was the end of apartheid in South Africa. Now, Palestine cannot wait that long, but all of this just has to start somewhere.
Yeah, money talks, and we all know what walks. Hard sanctions against Israel, complete cessation of trade, the recalling of the ambassador, and it hurts the people, and this is always the trouble, that it hurts the relatively innocent population of the country that you're sanctioning. But part of that's the point. Unpopular governments, even in despotic tyrannies, tend not to last long when they don't have some kind of popular support. There are exceptions, but it becomes more and more problematic for a government that has a failing economy to survive. And yeah, Australia, as you rightly said, with Doc Evatt as Secretary General of the United Nations, very much led the idea of a Palestinian state. And at the time, there were lots of people who said that we can't just carve out a block of land and give it to a bunch of foreigners. We have to make sure that the people who are already living there are looked after. So yeah, there's a lot to balance. Of course, the hardline view is that you just expel Israel altogether. I don't know that would be the wisest short-term solution, but certainly Israel needs to change its government and it needs to change its approach to foreign affairs, particularly in its own region, I think, to be taken seriously as a peaceful and constructive citizen of the world.
And the other point is that we can't pretend that recognition is just this magic wand and the final part of the process. And just looking at things historically, back in 1991, Croatia was recognised by Germany and the United States, and that was after the breakup of Yugoslavia. But the war continued for several months after that, and it was probably the most brutal part of that war in Croatia. The recognition of Bosnia just next door from Croatia in 1992, well, that sparked a brutal 3-year conflict and a genocide in Bosnia where over 200,000 people were killed. So recognition doesn't really mean much unless it's supported through other means, through other support as well provided by the international community. And I think this is where Australia could make a big contribution, either through diplomatic support, well, just as it did back in 1947. And Australia could be a big leader in this area, Dave. And I think you've pointed this out before, that Australia can be a big diplomatic leader all around the world, not just in the Pacific region. And it's just a question of whether Australia and the international community want to keep the promises that we made, the entire international community made to the people of Palestine all the way back in 1947.
Australia has a history with Palestine. If you look at many of the war memorials around, those from World War I mention our role in Palestine. And I find it puzzling that the anti-Palestine mob are also the most pro-Anzac mob. And they'll say, oh, Palestine never existed, Palestine was just a thing. And then on most war memorials, you'll have Palestine, Gallipoli, the Somme, Britain, Via de Britain, all of the battles and all of the places that Australians went. And there's no shame in helping the Palestinian people. And there never has been any shame in it. And yet some of the overreactions, Sky News, I think, was probably collectively needed to be taken to a hospital for a cup of tea, a Bex and a good lie down. The morally repugnant action, without really explaining why it's morally repugnant. Of course, in the dog whistle, it's because it's a Muslim country and we don't want to be helping Muslims. It's all right to wipe out Palestinians because, and then every type of weasel word. Quite an interesting display of psychological projection, calling the Albanese government morally repugnant for doing the right thing at last. We could have argued before, and we have argued before, that there's been some quite major moral failings with the Albanese government in regards to this. Now they're starting to turn around. It doesn't really make what's happened in the past right, but at least they're starting to point in the right direction, I suppose.
And the politics of Israel and Palestine is never going to be that simple in Australia. And right now we're seeing exactly how messy this can all get. And the leader of the Liberal Party, Susan Lee, she's been out there whipping up her frenzy, just like our good friend Peter Dutton used to when he was the leader. And she's promising to reverse this recognition of Palestine by the Albanese government. And the good thing is that this won't be able to happen anytime soon, because she'll have to become the Prime Minister to reverse this decision when it actually goes ahead in September. And I'm just looking at my notes, David. I'm down for the coalition losing the 2028 election, 2031 election, and maybe even the one after that. So this is all just not going to happen. And there's a whole range of others who have joined Susan Lee in making the same comments pretty much. There's Angus Taylor, there's Dave Sharma, and then there's Michaela Cash. And she's in a league of her own when it comes to these issues.
I mean, Hamas have been very clear. They have welcomed other countries recognising a Palestinian state. And do you know what they've said? This is a fruit of October the 7th.
And we have to remember that Susan Lee was once the leader of the Parliamentary Friends of Palestine. We also have to remember that she was a punk rocker too. But she's no longer a friend, and this is all just so cynical as far as I'm concerned. And defending Israel and Zionism leads to all sorts of absurdities. And just like we see in the UK with all of those pensioners and people in wheelchairs being locked up for supporting Palestine action, that's quite an absurd situation. We haven't reached that stage yet, but we're probably on the way there. But the public has just moved way ahead on this issue. We had the 300,000 people supporting the March for Humanity in Sydney, as you mentioned, David. Polling shows that 45% of Australians do support Palestine, and with just 23% of people opposed. And even for the Liberal Party voters, there's an even split between those who support and those who oppose. So I think the message is pretty clear, David, but for some reason, Susan Lee and the Liberal Party, they just want to keep being on that wrong side of the history.
And it's obviously the wrong side of the history too. Nobody should support a genocide. And I know that there's a lot of weasel terms around, it's not a genocide, it's just this one part, it's not this, it's not that. Every major genocide expert has called it a genocide. The United Nations has called it a genocide. Now, I know we'll lose a lot of conspiracy nuts there, but the overwhelming evidence is that it's a genocide. So how they support it, I have no idea. It's quite incredible. What we have to do is ignore these calls. Of course, our press won't ignore them. But for those of us who want to see a just world in which everybody can live fairly, I think we just have to not engage with, and here we are engaging, but we have to not engage with a lot of these calls because they're ridiculous.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
As Israel prepares for a military occupation of Gaza City, it's facing growing condemnation tonight for the targeted strike on a group of Palestinian journalists in their tent outside a hospital. Allahu Akbar. Emotional funerals today to remember prominent Al Jazeera news correspondent Anas al-Sharif, 4 of his colleagues and another freelancer. Israel has defended the strike, calling al-Sharif a terrorist who helped Hamas launch rocket attacks. But Al Jazeera and the Committee to Protect Journalists say they have no proof.
Israel killed 6 Palestinian journalists in Gaza during the week, including the high-profile reporter Anas al-Sharif. And this takes the number of journalists killed by Israel over the past 2 years in Gaza up to 240. And aside from the issue of Israel doing this to stop the news of its genocide getting out of Gaza, and not much luck in doing that, and breaking every international law in doing this, there just hasn't been very much support or solidarity from mainstream media journalists in Australia. And this is quite different to responses in other conflicts, which have rightly been called out. There's been a lot of outrage from the actions of Russia against journalists in Ukraine and within Russia itself, and there's been quite a few murders and disappearances there over the past decade. There was also the outrage about the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi Arabia in 2018. Again, the outrage there was rightfully justified. And journalists and reporters do the important work of highlighting injustices all around the world and holding truth to power. That's the true role of journalism. But there just seems to be different rules for any kind of support of Palestine in Australia. As we found out in the Antoinette Lattouf case and for cricket journalist Peter Lalor, people removed for offering any support, real or perceived, for Palestine. But this is the nature of journalism. You report this information without fear or favour, and Antoinette Lattouf and Peter Lalor, they paid the price for that, and they have to be commended for their actions. And I'm sorry that they lost their jobs when they shouldn't have, but for all of those other journalists out there, well, if you're not prepared to report the truth and report on what's actually happening in the world, well, you're just working in the wrong industry and it might be time to get out.
George Orwell said something that if you're not holding power to account, you're just doing PR. That's a paraphrase, and I know that everyone out there will say, no, he said it like this, and you're correct. But it's true. You've got to be prepared to say when people have done the wrong thing, that they've done the wrong thing. And that comes at a cost sometimes. It shouldn't come at a cost at all. What happened to Antoinette Lattouf was terrible. What happened to Peter Lalor was terrible. Not as bad, perhaps, as what happened to Anas al-Sharif or the Khashoggi, but it's all part of a spectrum where a power being held to account didn't like it. And the interesting thing is that these acts always backfire. With Antoinette Lattouf, the whole board of the ABC and management of the ABC damaged its reputation badly. Same with Peter Lalor. When a journalist gets killed in Gaza, no one says that was the right thing to do. Everybody says it's terrible, and it ruins the point. And then we notice other journalists come up. And I think that's important to recognise too, that truth will always find a way. It might take a long way to get through, but it will find a way.
And Australia likes to think that press freedom in Australia is alive and well, but that's only the case for certain issues. And on issues related to Palestine, well, it just seems to be quite different. It's all progressive except for Palestine. And we saw what happened with Antoinette Lattouf and Peter Lalor, mild support for Palestine, and that's the end of their career. And at least in Australia, you lose your career if you're a journalist. In Palestine, you actually lose your life. But if you're pro-Israel in Australia's mainstream media, well, there just doesn't seem to be any problem at all. And if there were equal penalties and punishments applied for this pro-Israel position, well, there just wouldn't be anyone left in all the newsrooms around the country, David. And Israel has killed 240 journalists in Gaza, and that's 2 each week, each and every week over the past 2 years. And that's more than any other modern conflict. Now, the next highest number is in Iraq, and it shouldn't be a competition, but I'm just putting out these numbers for context. And the next highest is in Iraq, and that was 81 journalists killed over 8 years. And this incident of 6 journalists being murdered by Israel, it's a little bit like the Balibo 5 back from 1975, and that's where 5 journalists were executed by Indonesia in East Timor. It was actually 6 journalists in total, including Roger East, who went over to East Timor to investigate what was going on, and he was also executed by the Indonesian military as well. So it's quite a big thing to have this amount of journalists killed, well, at the one time. It's a big thing for having 240 killed over 2 years, but this is quite a big incident, and I can't imagine the Australian public being quiet over the Balibo 5 or the Balibo 6, although the Australian government did actually want to forget about all of that and just hope that it all went away. But this is quite a big incident when this sort of stuff happens. But I think it's also about the universal application of protection for journalists. And sure, I'll accept that journalists will die during a conflict just by virtue of being there, but this is a deliberate targeting of journalists. It's against international law, and it's totally unacceptable.
Yeah, we would prefer that no innocent people were killed in a war at all, but journalists on the front line reporting may get caught up in events that are beyond everybody's control. And that's a terrible thing, but it's different to the targeting of journalists deliberately to silence them. And yeah, don't want to say that there's anything at all acceptable in the death of anyone in combat, but it's a slightly different thing. I think what we need to do is work out some way of separating vested commercial and industrial interests with the press. And I think we've got to fundamentally change human nature anyway. Journalists will always run a dangerous job, particularly if they're doing it properly. It's not a flaw of the system necessarily that they're being killed, they're being suppressed, they're being jailed. We can throw in people like Julian Assange into that pile of journalists who've been mistreated. It is a flaw of a much broader system that allows power to be determined by other things other than popular or democratic fiat. I think we need to knock society down and start it all over again in many ways.
And there's also that balance between journalistic ethics and commercial reality. And the mainstream media might think that advertisers will pull their campaigns if a news outlet starts reporting the events in Gaza in a more balanced way or is mildly critical of Israel. And I think that's a commercial pressure that we do have to consider. It shouldn't be the be-all and end-all, but that's a consideration that does have to be taken into account when reporting on these matters. So we've got that at that level, but then there's another level which is outright bullshit, which is what happened with the Sydney Morning Herald during the week, where they wrote an entire story claiming that one of the founders of Hamas, Sheikh Hassan Youssef, had praised Anthony Albanese for recognising Palestine. And the issue here is that the story was a complete lie. Youssef is in an Israeli prison. There's no way that he'd be able to speak to the media, and certainly not to any media in Australia. And then News Corporation, the ABC, The Guardian and the SBS, they all ran with the story that Hamas supports Albanese and supports Australia's decision. But the issue was that there was just no evidence at all. And David, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, but I'd looked it up in about 2 minutes, or ascertained within 2 or 3 minutes that this story just did not exist, that this information just did not exist. But the entire media, mainstream media in Australia, ran with this story. There's just no evidence. There was nothing in English, nothing in Arabic. And the journalist in question, Matthew Knott, made it seem like he'd spoken to Youssef. So in Gaza and in so many countries around the world where there is a conflict, we have journalists who are committed to speaking truth to power, who are prepared to die to get that truth. But in Australia, or in Australia's mainstream media, journalists run propaganda on behalf of the State of Israel, and they actually want to be part of that power rather than interrogate that power. And I think that's a real problem within Australian journalism.
It is. It's why, not again, maybe to blow our own horn a little bit, but it's why independent media is really important.
You can blow the entire brass section if you like, David.
But if it wasn't for independent media, we'd get no real conflicting or no real alternate views. And stuff like this would just go unquestioned. The mainstream media has a very strong grip on what people say is truth. A lot of people won't believe something's happened till it's happened on the news, for example. Now, in a sense, this is understandable. You want to make sure that what you're hearing is credible, but we need a news that isn't prepared to put slants on things. We need a news that isn't prepared to lie. Now, even if the Hamas said, oh, this is a good thing, of course they're going to say that anyway.
Well, generally it is a good thing anyway.
Yeah, that's what I mean. If we come up with a cure for cancer and Kim Jong-un had said this is a good thing, it doesn't make it a bad thing, even though we don't like Kim Jong-un. And it was a way of trying to tie this view to terrorism. And Hamas is not just a terrorist organisation anyway, so it's a lot more complex than that.
Oh, of course it is. And Hamas is only listed as a terrorist organisation in about 6 countries around the world. But they exist as a resistance movement. Well, similar to the ANC in South Africa. They were registered as a terrorist organisation for many years, and now they're the ruling party in government.
The French resistance in World War II, the IRA, these approaches are complex and nuanced. And yes, if you were British soldier stationed in Northern Ireland in the mid-70s, the IRA was a terrorist organisation. But if you were a Northern Irish citizen, the IRA was a freedom-fighting organisation working for the best. For some Northern Irish people, of course, they were a terrorist organisation or a criminal organisation even. It all depends on your point of view when it comes to this type of stuff. We're not talking Sydney underworld here where they're all criminals. They know they're all criminals. They call themselves criminals. It's a much more complex and nuanced position than X is bad and A is good. There's a range of ideas. And of course, we condemn the bad parts about it, but we also understand that for some people, it's their only hope.
David, this all seems a little bit mundane to talk about interest rate cuts after what we've just discussed, but that's what the Reserve Bank did during the week when they reduced the cash rate by 0.25 points down to 3.6%. And this followed through with the typical pattern where there had been a big clamouring from the media and from the Liberal Party that interest rates need to come down for the Labor government to have any sort of economic credibility at all. And now that they have come down, well, that's a sign of a lack of economic credibility, and it's a vote of no confidence by the Reserve Bank in the Labor government. Here's the Shadow Treasurer, Ted O'Brien.
It is, however, also a vote of no confidence by the RBA in the Albanese government's economic plan. And I say that because of the RBA's decision to downgrade the forecast of economic growth and also of productivity. This is bad news because it means Australians are only going to see their living standards worsen over the times ahead.
And David, we just keep forgetting that golden rule that interest rates going down is great news when the Liberal Party's in government, and somehow it's terrible news when the Labor Party's in government. Here's the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, in response to Ted O'Brien.
Well, I didn't think they could find someone with less credibility than Angus Taylor, but they've managed to do that as Shadow Treasurer in Ted O'Brien. I thought it was frankly an absurd comment that will do him no good and do his credibility no good. If he was a half-decent Shadow Treasurer, he would have properly welcomed this, not just pretended to have welcomed it. And he would grasp the opportunity that I've provided him to play a constructive role in the way that Australia gets around and meets the moment when it comes to these big economic challenges. I thought his press conference today was a disgrace, frankly. He should be properly welcoming interest rate relief for millions of Australians. He didn't want to see rates cut today. And I think all of his words today were dripping with disappointment.
And this is all within the theatre of politics, which has now become the theatre of the absurd for the Liberal Party. In politics, the opposition has to provide an opposing perspective. We all understand that. But to provide a perspective that is just so absurd, I think it's counterproductive to the political fortunes of the Liberal Party. And generally, interest rates have to be set according to what the needs of the economy are. We've always pointed that out, David. And it's best to spread the benefit of whatever the interest rates are to as many people as possible. And lower interest rates are good for mortgage holders and for business, and it's not so great for everyone. There are those people who depend on higher interest rates for either their main income or for a supplementary income, but they've probably got enough money anyway to cater for all of those issues. But for the Liberal Party to come in with this over-the-top negativity when the electorate can actually see that this is all good economic news, I just think that this is mindless politics and they just need to do a lot better.
They're trying to grab back the Liberal Party are the better economic manager title that they held by default. And by that I mean that there was never any genuine evidence that they managed the economy consistently better than the Labor Party. And in fact, over the last some time, hasn't been true at all. And of course, as an opposition, they want to ruin any good news that the government might have. And an overdue rate cut, a too late rate cut, is still good news for the government. We said before that the rate should have been cut. And indeed, I think we questioned why Jim Chalmers didn't step in and cut the rates. They seem to be going down. There'll probably be another cut before the end of the year, maybe two. That's going to depend on a couple of other factors. Having said that, the bank has taken an extremely cautious approach to things. So I don't want to predict anything because I don't know what they're going to do over the next few cycles. And it wouldn't surprise me if they put them up again for a bit just to make sure we're all on our toes.
But just looking at the political behaviour of the coalition, and I think the electorate has been crystal clear about all of this. To me, that's what the 2025 election results showed, that people just want politics done differently. They're sick and tired of the same old game where the government says one thing and the opposition, in a knee-jerk reaction, just says the complete opposite, even when it's something sensible. And next week, the federal government is holding a national economic reform meeting, and that's a chance to talk about how to make the economy more productive, how to make it more resilient, how to strengthen the budget and make it more sustainable in the long-term future. And I think that sounds like it's a pretty good thing to do. And what has the coalition got to offer? Well, they're not saying, well, yes, let's be part of this conversation. Here's some constructive options. Here's some alternatives. You might be doing it this way, but we think that this way might be better. Not doing any of that. It's just the same old carping and the negativity, saying that nothing good is going to come out of this reform meeting, even though the reform meeting hasn't actually happened yet. And I think this is the problem for the coalition. David, we're always here to help the Liberal Party, and we're giving up our time for free generously to the Liberal Party, if only they just listen to us. But modern politics isn't just about saying no. That's over. That's what Peter Dutton used to do. He'd say no to absolutely everything, and look where he is. Well, we don't know where he is, but he's not in politics anymore. But voters are just looking for something a bit more sophisticated. They're looking for political parties that can actually solve their problems and start actually mapping out a vision for the future. And if the coalition could think long-term, start looking at the bigger picture and presenting themselves as a positive part of the political process, well, they might actually start rebuilding trust with the electorate and get back into office at some point pretty soon. But the way that I read it is that they seem to believe that 2025 was their low watermark, and because it is, or it was their low watermark, that the only way is to go up. But that's not how politics works. To get away from rock bottom, it doesn't happen automatically. It takes a lot of discipline. It takes a clear strategy and a clear understanding of where the country wants to go. And so far in this term, and sure, it's only been a few months, but the Liberal Party's been absolutely rubbish on all of this. They just haven't changed at all. And if the Liberal Party wants to become a serious contender within politics, it just needs to ditch that reflexive sort of opposition, stop fighting battles that don't really matter to voters, stop all this culture war crap and start offering a real alternative. Otherwise, they're just going to be stuck in old politics and they're going to be stuck in opposition for forever, pretty much. And sure, if they want to do that, that's all fine. It might be nice and comfortable for them to be in this sort of internal debating club, but they're just not going to get anywhere.
It's the old attributed to Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing twice and expecting a different result. Suzanne Lee started off pretty well, but she's starting to fall into the old habits, whether she's being advised to by the party or whether she's thinking that this is what people want. Of course, there's that, I'll call it the Sky News bubble, where the pollsters, Kos Samaras and his business partner, pointed out that a lot of Liberal Party members get their policy ideas from Sky News and then force that through the branches, which then the Federal Party has to somehow deal with.
And it might not be a bubble, David. It might be more like a concrete bunker.
Yeah. No alternate ideas are considered. The liberalism is exactly as Sky After Dark tells you, Peter Credlin, and they're the ones telling the membership what to do. And of course, a lot of the membership are reasonable, fairly intelligent, hardworking Australians who want to improve Australia and don't see the Sky News way. So they leave. And both parties are in a membership crisis at the moment. And the Liberal Party's approach to listening to Sky News and bringing out, moving further to the right after the right is comprehensively rejected is not going to help it at all. And they've got to realise that it's time to really think about where is the sensible centre and how do we claim the sensible centre back.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
There's a government report that's still being kept under wraps, and that's the National Climate Risk Assessment that was meant to be released before the 2025 federal election but remains unreleased. And if it contained any good news, well, the government would have released it a long time ago, but I'd suggest that there's no good news to come out at all on these climate issues or these climate change issues. And parts of the report have been leaked, and it outlines the damage that will be done through climate change, the human toll from worsening heat waves, flooding, and it also looks at the risks to the economy and national security, including food chains, health, and the natural environment. Now, David, we've known about all of these issues for some time, and governments of all persuasions are keen to avoid doing very much to address these issues, and as well as this report not being released before the last election and still being kept under wraps. Now, there's other material that hasn't been released, including the 2035 emissions targets and the plans to adapt to these targets. And the economic effects of climate change are being felt. We can feel that very obviously. We felt it all during this week. Well, certainly in Sydney anyway. The extreme weather around Australia for the first half of this year has already cost an estimated $2.2 billion to the economy, and is probably going to cost a lot more going into the future. Now, the Australian Greens are calling for this climate risk assessment report to be released immediately, and the Australian public does have a right to know what the government is planning to do with climate risk management and climate change issues, and it just can't keep locking away the details forever.
No, I know that they hope that the news cycle will move on, but unfortunately for them, this is a existential issue. This goes beyond a ministerial scandal. This goes beyond a policy failure. This really talks to the future of the planet, the future of humanity. They need to fix as quickly as possible. It may be too late. Some climate scientists are saying it's too late. All we can do now is ameliorate and start building and moving away and restructuring. But for a lot of people, it's too late. Other climate scientists say we have a small window, but we have to get it done in the next 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, then it'll be too late. Neither approach is terribly positive or hopeful for the future. So they may as well release the report, cop the backlash, but then start to work on it and either ameliorate or fix, depending on who's right. And there are people out there who say, oh, no, it's the reason that the report's not being released is that it's totally against that. There's no problem and they don't want that because they want us to live in fear and all of this. That's not what the evidence suggests. We all know what's in it, but we need to know, is it too late and how do we fix it?
So this was the report that the government quietly shelved before the last election, and they also delayed the creation of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency until after the election. Still no plans to introduce that, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. And it's obvious that they canned the report and the EPA, or the creation of the EPA, because they didn't want any... Well, because there's no good news about the environment in there, and they just didn't want this to be a distraction during the 2025 election campaign. That's what all governments do, but that election is over. Labor won 94 seats at that election, and there's no election for another 3 years. So you think, well, what's the big hold up here? The public does have a right to know what's in that report and what the government is going to do about climate change issues. And there is that big economic reform meeting that's coming up next week that we talked about before, and you can't talk about all of the areas that are affecting the economy or affecting productivity or affecting reform, and that's in the areas of health and agriculture and infrastructure and defence. You can't talk about all of those things and not talk about the thing that's going to affect all of those areas, and that's climate change and extreme weather events. And if you're not going to talk about those things, well, you're not really serious about economic reform and productivity. And there's also the possibility, David, that these events are now becoming so frequent. There's the floods, the fires, the heat waves. They're just happening so often that we're now getting used to them. And when Kevin Rudd talked about the climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our times, well, he wasn't kidding, and many people believed him, and that was in 2007. That was 18 years ago. But now it's almost like governments are paying lip service to climate change issues. And Just looking at electric cars, they reduce greenhouse emissions all up. I know that when you take into effect all the electricity that they might use up and all the parts that go into the batteries and all that sort of stuff, overall they do reduce greenhouse emissions. But the government is now looking at ways of taxing electric vehicles because they're losing tax revenue on petrol excise. And the sensible thing to do would be to have no tax on electric vehicles, increase the petrol excise so you're getting more electric vehicles onto the road and less greenhouse gases. But the government is planning to do the exact opposite of what's required and reducing incentives for getting an electric vehicle on the road. And it's just another example of government just not being serious on climate change issues at all.
I'm guessing it's the gas lobby, it's the coal lobby, it's the agricultural lobby, some of whom, not all. I know that there are a lot of farmers out there who are very worried about the environment, and we're starting to see green candidates either get up or get very close to getting up in rural seats. I think that there's a lot of vested interest that don't want action on the environment, who don't believe that it's warranted, let's be fair, but who also will see that if it is warranted, it would cut into their own profit margin, or cut into their power base, it'll cut into their influence, and that the problem can be solved down the track after they're no longer part of the process. And yet Labor has close ties to mining unions, and those mining unions want to keep their jobs. And as a result, we have there Labor torn between fixing it, the environment, and protecting its members, or at least some of its members. These problems can be solved, but it takes a bit of will on both sides, that we retrain from mining into solar power farming, or we retrain from mining into other things, or we mine differently, and we've discussed this before on the podcast. It's not easy, but it's becoming necessary, and the further we go through, the more necessary it becomes. And everyone's got to sit down and say, hold on, there's no point in having all the money and all the wealth and all the wisdom and all the knowledge in the world if there is no world.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.